When it comes to gruesome, spine-chilling horror games from the golden age of gaming, one title still sends shivers down the spines of retro gamers: Splatterhouse 2. Released for the Sega Genesis in 1992, this game is the perfect follow-up to the original Splatterhouse, continuing its legacy of blood-soaked beat-em-up action with an unapologetically grotesque aesthetic. Splatterhouse 2 stood out not just for its excessive gore, but for its atmosphere. For fans of horror films, this game was a love letter to the gory slasher flicks of the 80s, dripping with visual and thematic influences from movies like Friday the 13th, Evil Dead, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The game didn't hold back on shock value, and for its time, it was one of the goriest experiences you could find on any console. But beneath the carnage, Splatterhouse 2 was also a deeply challenging and satisfying beat-em-up with tight mechanics, pushing players to master its relentless side-scrolling combat. The story of Splatterhouse 2 picks up right where the original left off, continuing the gruesome tale of Rick Taylor and his desperate quest to save his girlfriend, Jennifer. After the horrifying events in the first game, Rick is left traumatized and guilt-ridden. Jennifer is presumed dead, and Rick has lost the one person he truly loved, seemingly forever. But just when all hope seems lost, the sinister Hell Mask, an ancient, malevolent artifact, returns, offering Rick one last chance to rescue Jennifer from the clutches of an otherworldly nightmare. This time, the mask promises that if Rick returns to the haunted mansion, he can bring Jennifer back. The Hell Mask, with its dark powers, is both Rick's savior and his curse. It possesses the ability to transform him into a powerful, hulking beast, capable of taking on the gruesome monsters that inhabit the Splatterhouse, but at a terrible cost. The plot in Splatterhouse 2 is simple but effective, driving home the themes of desperation, sacrifice, and horror. Rick is not a typical video game hero. He's a man on the edge, haunted by his failures, and willing to do anything to save Jennifer. The game's story plays out through its grim and oppressive environments, with the atmosphere and enemy designs telling a story of Rick's nightmarish descent into madness. Throughout the game, Rick encounters terrifying bosses, horrific abominations that stand as physical representations of the evil that grips the mansion. From a massive tentacle creature that bursts through walls to a towering beast made of flesh and bone, each boss is more terrifying than the last, making Rick's journey feel like a descent into hell itself. The simplicity of the plot in Splatterhouse 2 is part of what makes it so effective. It's not about complex twists or intricate lore. It's a pure, raw tale of survival and horror, driven by Rick's need to save Jennifer no matter the cost. The minimalistic storytelling, combined with the oppressive atmosphere, creates a constant sense of dread, making the player feel as trapped and desperate as Rick himself. In the world of Splatterhouse, there are no real victories, only temporary survival in the face of overwhelming darkness. At its core, Splatterhouse 2 is a side-scrolling beat-em-up, but what makes it stand out from others in the genre is the sheer brutality and relentless action. Players take control of Rick, donning the sinister Hell Mask once again, as he punches, kicks, and bludgeons his way through a wave after wave of grotesque monsters, mutants, and abominations. It's a game that lives and dies by its simplicity, focusing on tight, no-nonsense combat that packs a punch, literally. The controls are straightforward, but mastering them is key to survival. Rick's movements feel deliberate, almost heavy, which fits perfectly with the horror aesthetic. Unlike the fast-paced action of games like Streets of Rage or Final Fight, Splatterhouse 2 leans into a slower, more methodical style. Rick doesn't sprint across the screen, but when he lands a punch, you can almost feel the impact. But don't let the straightforward controls fool you. This game is punishing. Splatterhouse 2 requires precision, quick reflexes, and an almost tactical approach to survive its relentless enemies. Every level is packed with horrifying creatures that swarm Rick, each with their own attack patterns and ways to keep you on your toes. The bosses in particular are nightmarish in both design and difficulty. The levels themselves are linear, but Splatterhouse 2 constantly shifts its environments to keep you feeling uneasy. You'll find yourself battling through decaying mansions, grotesque swamps, and bloody caverns, all dripping with a macabre atmosphere. The environmental hazards are just as deadly as the enemies themselves. Spiked traps, ooze-filled pits, and giant tentacles can end your run just as easily as the monsters lurking around every corner. The difficulty is another hallmark of Splatterhouse 2. While some modern players might find it frustrating, back in the day this was par for the course for many games. Splatterhouse 2 rewards perseverance and learning from your mistakes. Every time you die, you get a little better at navigating the traps, avoiding enemy attacks, and figuring out the best ways to deal with the nightmarish bosses. It's a game that doesn't hold your hand, but that's exactly what makes it so satisfying when you finally make it through to the end. Despite its simplicity, Splatterhouse 2 is an intense, bloody beat-em-up that stands out because of its unforgiving difficulty, its visceral combat, and its grim horror atmosphere. It's a game that keeps you on edge, constantly fighting for survival in a world that feels like it's straight out of a slasher film. Whether you're bashing in heads with a 2x4 or carefully inching through a trap-filled corridor, the gameplay keeps you hooked, making every victory feel well-earned. The graphics and sound of Splatterhouse 2 play a massive role in cementing the game's dark, oppressive atmosphere. For a game released in 1992 on the Sega Genesis, Splatterhouse 2 pushed the boundaries of what was visually and audibly acceptable in video games at the time, delivering a grotesque experience that stuck with players long after they put the controller down. Splatterhouse 2 fully embraces its horror influences. The art design is dripping with gore and macabre detail. The environments are bleak, often bathed in dark, moody colors that enhance the feeling of dread and isolation. The enemy designs are equally disturbing. From zombie-like creatures to abominations of flesh and bone, each monster is designed to evoke a sense of revulsion. The bosses are where the game's designers truly let their imaginations run wild. You face massive, grotesque horrors that look like they've stepped straight out of an 80s body horror flick. The game doesn't shy away from showing the results of Rick's brutality. Blood splatters and body parts fly across the screen with every hit, reminding players why this game was considered so controversial back in the day. Moving on to the sound design, Splatterhouse 2 excels at creating a tense, eerie atmosphere that keeps you on edge. The soundtrack is filled with low, droning tones and unsettling rhythms that fit the game's dark visuals perfectly. Rather than relying on catchy melodies or upbeat tunes like many other games from that era, Splatterhouse 2 focuses on creating an ambiance of dread. The music is haunting, with slow, ominous beats that build tension as you progress through each level. The sound effects are also crucial to the game's horror atmosphere. Every punch, every enemy scream, and every gruesome splatter of blood is accentuated with over-the-top sound effects that add to the visceral experience of combat. Compared to its predecessor, Splatterhouse 2 takes full advantage of the Genesis hardware to push both its visual and audio boundaries. Splatterhouse 2 is a visual and auditory assault on the senses, combining grimy, disturbing imagery with bone-chilling sound design to create an experience that is as memorable as it is terrifying. It's a game that lingers with you, its nightmarish landscapes and unsettling music burned into your mind long after the final boss has been defeated. Splatterhouse the 2nd of May not have been the most well-known or mainstream title when it hit shelves in 1992, but over the years it has earned its place as a cult classic in the world of retro gaming. The Splatterhouse series as a whole played a crucial role in shaping the horror genre in video games, and Splatterhouse 2 built upon the foundation laid by its predecessor to cement itself as an unforgettable experience, especially for fans of horror and beat-em-up titles. At the time of its release, Splatterhouse 2 faced mixed reactions. Critics pointed out its high difficulty level and simplistic gameplay, common complaints for many games of the era, but it was the game's extreme violence and grotesque imagery that truly sparked controversy. The game was infamous for pushing boundaries, earning it a reputation similar to the one held by violent films in the 1980s. It's hard to overstate how shocking the gore and horror elements of Splatterhouse 2 were back then. This was a time when parental advisory boards were keeping a close watch on video games. This notoriety only added to its allure for gamers who were looking for something darker, edgier, and more adult than the usual platformers and action games of the time. It became one of those games that people would whisper about on the playground, sparking curiosity among those too young to play it. Over time, Splatterhouse 2 became known not just for its shock factor, but for how it embodied the spirit of horror in a way that few other games had attempted. Ultimately, the legacy of Splatterhouse 2 isn't just in its guts and gore, it's in the lasting impact it had on gamers who craved a different kind of experience, something darker, more visceral, and more intense than what was traditionally offered in the early 90s. It's a game that still finds its way into conversations today, not just for its controversial content, but for the way it pushed the boundaries of what a horror video game could be. In the world of retro horror, Splatterhouse 2 remains a bloody, unforgettable icon.